Immersed, Ali versus Bailey. Chronicled your X Division championship match at Slammiversary. I'll just say to start, I talked to Santana yesterday, and I kind of just told him, I'm really enjoying the storytelling devices that TNA has been able to use over the past few months. This material has added so much. I feel like your immersed episode specifically, like really, really highlighted a lot of things that I'm glad you brought up as far as uh being in Montreal, being a foreigner, overcoming some of those obstacles. Uh Now that people are going to get a chance to see this episode, is there like a big takeaway that you have that you want them? Because I said there's a lot going on in this. Is there like one major takeaway that you really think highlighted your career or something, a point that you were trying to communicate about your work?
I think it's very hard to narrow down to one thing, right? But the way I've always felt about professional wrestling, especially modern professional wrestling, and it's something TNA has consistently being has been constantly doing a great job with, is that what you see, the actual match, right? The actual 20 minutes or so that Ali and I spent in the ring really is the just the tip of the iceberg,
Mhm.
and that's what the audience really gets to see. And then beyond that, you know what I mean, there was the month-long feud, the build up, the matches, the storylines that led up to the match. But even like further behind that is two very complete human beings that put so much effort and hard work, and like this is their careers culminating. And I mean, the story behind the match runs so much deeper than two, to not to go back to the cliche, but two men without pants fighting for a golden belt. Uh, it's really two like human beings with their own paths that have taken them there. And I mean, Ali has his own story with like representing a culture and having a people, and trying to go and use this platform to promote their struggles is a big part of it. And I, in a completely different way, have kind of doing I'm kind of doing the same thing, right? And this is
Mhm.
very much a story about being Quebecois. And then you had Earl Hebner in there and his own story of redemption. And this is just a wrestling match. It's a 10-minute wrestling match, but this allows you to see like lives being actually changed by this fight.
Mhm. Yeah, and I like there's a lot, and I'm gonna kind of go over some of it, but one of the things that I liked is they didn't really show you interacting in this, which I feel like could be like, yeah, we know like people are friends backstage, whatever, but I feel like there was maybe a conscious effort to maybe film you guys uh in two different settings. Like they had Ali in this like white room and he's talking about his own personal struggles, but then like you weren't sitting next to him doing like the face off, like the classic wrestling like final promo before the pay-per-view stuff. Like even though that's going on in the ring, it didn't repeat here. It was a completely different dynamic. I really like that. And I mentioned that, you brought up a great point about being a foreigner. It's a Toronto-based company, like Anthem's based in Canada now. So I feel like there's a dynamic shift where I feel like there's a sense of pride, a different sense of pride in Canada than maybe being from the United States because you're so used to having so many companies like based in the United States where you brought up like not only is it being from Canada, but Montreal and then on a smaller scale being from Quebec, and there's certain things that you have to overcome, like you brought up uh learning to speak English, and there's different things you have to deal with being a pro wrestler. I just really appreciated you saying that because I don't think people realize how many different obstacles international talent face whether it's when they come to the United States or just going to a new environment in general. There's always this sort of nitpicking going on, I guess, and it was refreshing to kind of see you call it out and show how you overcome those things, not just being like well, here's what I have to do. No, it's I've already done these things. I'm on my way to being where I need to be.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't want to make it seem either like the struggle with being Quebecois is like especially unique when it comes to pro wrestling. At least
Mhm.
there's a very rich culture and history when it comes to professional wrestling in Quebec. But you talk about the struggles of being outside of America, right? Obviously, the United States is where most of the pro wrestling happens in the world. I mean, just
Mhm.
because of the culture, because of the economic structure of the United States. And I was, I don't want to say a victim of that because victim seems like I'm shifting the blame, right? But I
Mhm.
was banned from the United States for 5 years and I was forced to go, travel around the world. And I spent a lot of time in countries that have a lot of pro wrestling where it's possible to make a living as a professional wrestler, like Mexico, Japan, and England. But I also traveled to many other places in the world where becoming a pro wrestler is not a thing. It's not a concept. It's not something you can do.
Mhm.
You can kind of do pro wrestling as a side hobby, but given the lack of, cultural history behind professional wrestling, if you really want to have a go at it, you have to create a scene for yourself.
Mhm.
And seeing a lot of people, it's always the funniest when you go to like Southeast Asia, right? When I wrestle in uh let's say Singapore, for example, and people are a mix of cultures. There's Chinese, there's Malay, there's like Muslim and everything, but they still, what's your wrestling name? Oh, my name is Bill Flame, even though your real name couldn't
Yeah.
be further from Bill Flame, but it's just you present yourself as an American because that's the kind of the perception of professional wrestling, and add to that the fact that English is your fourth language because you're from
Mhm.
Singapore and you watch pro wrestling on television and you try to sound like the performers you've been seeing,
Mhm.
and there's very much this idea that that still happens to this day within pro wrestling that if you don't, sound like the top performers of the 1990s, you can't cut a promo, even it's
Mhm.
just because, your voice is different or you have an accent. And there's a lot of struggles that come with that. And I mean, that's that, like barring the geographical struggles, just the ones that come from within, the mental struggles, the finding your place, the being able to relate to those people. And of course, it's a very big thing in Quebec. It was a very big thing for me, but I think it's important to highlight that for people that want to become a professional wrestler from all over the world.
Yeah. And if was it Kevin Owens said he learned English by watching Stone Cold?
He did. It
Yeah,
wasn't
so it's
Stone
like
Cold. So he said specifically Jim Ross.
okay.
And the example he uses is thinking slobber knocker is just a normal word that everyone uses when it's the most Jim Ross word.
Yeah. So it's I mean, I think people are more I don't want to say forgiving either because I don't think it's it's
Doesn't need to be forgiven. Yeah.
I'm inspired by him saying that. Like, good for you, like wanting to learn and be closer to, being a pro wrestler that you see on TV and that stuff. But I like that you brought up, like Singapore and Asia over there because we had a writer that went to it's Dakota, I think, and Zack Sabre Jr. It was in the Philippines, and it was kind of the same thing. It was like it was very cool seeing like Zack say how as a New Japan wrestler he wants to see them and other people go to the Philippines more, go to Singapore more, like, and you're starting to see that where now it's like more of an individual talent basis, but it would be really cool to see companies if they could do that on a larger scale.
I completely agree. And that is definitely something that I would love to see TNA do in the near future. uh, go further away from the United States outside of North America. I mean, I know there's plenty of places in Europe that are hungry for TNA, and I think that that's true of so many other places all over the world that would welcome to TNA. I mean, they did a couple of things in Australia last year, as well as the tour they did in England, and I think those both went great. So it'd be amazing to see TNA go around the world more and spread the word of professional wrestling.
Mhm. One more thing I want to talk about the episode before we move on to more current events. But what was it like sharing the ring with Earl Hebner and giving a new spin on the Montreal screw job? Because I'm really glad that Earl got a little bit of the spotlight here. What was it like sharing the ring with him?
Man, so the Montreal screw job to me, like, didn't feel like a real event, if that makes any sense. It feels mythical, especially coming from Montreal and hearing that talked about like so much all the time, and it being so like such a big part of like professional wrestling culture and history, right? There is no wrestling fan that's been watching for more than 2 years that doesn't know what it is, what happened, who
Hmm.
was involved. And in a weird way, I felt very removed from that. Because that like that era and that part of wrestling is not something that I've studied as much as I do modern wrestling.
Hmm.
Right. I'm a big X Division. I'm the X Division champion. I'm a big fan of the X Division. I always have been. That's the part of wrestling that I really fell deeply in love with. Of course, that mainstream TV wrestling was my uh my introduction to professional wrestling. But when I really fell in love with it and be like, oh, this is this exactly is what I want to do, was very much, the early X Division stuff, early American independent wrestling around that time, Japanese independent wrestling, uh, that really made me follow this. So feeling removed from the Montreal Screwjob and not feeling like it was a real thing, to then having Earl Hebner literally in the ring and being the continuation, being the part two to that
Hmm.
completely surreal moment. I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly, but it like the
It's
Montreal Screwjob did not feel like a real event. It felt, I think mythical is the best word. It felt like something
hmm.
straight out of scripture, right? It feels like the people involved are all, Bret Hart is one of the best professional wrestlers in history, and I don't think there's any debate on that. But our careers have not, overlapped at all. I only met
Yeah.
Bret Hart for about 5 seconds one time, and it all feels very like a different section of pro wrestling than what I've been a part of. So for those to intersect, right? For me and Mustafa Ali to have the match that we did, which looks entirely different than pro wrestling did at the time the screw job happened, but still have those stories overlap and
Hmm.
come together, I think was a celebration of both periods and a huge moment for everyone involved. And I mean, uh, the reaction from Earl Hebner himself and getting to interact with him and speak to him about the moment and his feelings in Montreal as a city and how he felt being there made it all the most surreal. Of course, it was a huge moment for him, which I would not expect literally the most famous professional wrestling referee in history, Earl Hebner, to still have feelings. I wouldn't expect him to care, but he absolutely did.
I have two different thoughts here. First, I kind of see it as like I started watching wrestling in like the Hulkamania era, like WrestleMania 5, 6. So like anything that comes before that, it like similar to what you're saying, like it doesn't really resonate with you as much. So like when
Yes.
people talk about like the NWA in the 70s and like sort of that stuff, I'm like, I know it happened. I can see footage, but like I don't resonate with it as much as like stuff, when I was a child. And have you seen Deadpool and Wolverine?
So I have never seen a Deadpool movie,
Okay.
but I feel like I saw it diagonally on a plane in the scene across from me about 100 times.
Okay. So I won't go like spoiler heavy, but it's kind of like what you said, like a celebration of two eras. And there was like the Fox movie era, and then now there's like the MCU. And it felt like a nice, like a celebration of the two meeting. So I absolutely get the point you're making with those two eras merging. Really quick, I do want to talk about Emergence coming up. You're going into the match as champion. Thoughts on the lineup? I'll say really quick. I like the mix of people in the match. Zach Wentz, Jason Hotch, Laredo Kid. You have Hammerstone getting in there, and then Riley Osborne from NXT. Um, I like that it's not just six guys that can do the same move sets. There's a lot of variety in this match.
Ultimate X is such an iconic match in the X division, and this is going to be my fourth time in Ultimate X. The first time was when I won my first X Division Championship at Slammiversary in 2022, and they are always a huge challenge because, as you said, it's a it's a real mix of styles, and it's such an iconic match. And it feels like if you watch the history of the Ultimate X, and if you try to have really good ones, you're ultimately competing with Frankie Kazarian and the Motor City Machine Guns in terms of trying to find new ways to use that structure. It's an X above the ring, right? It's
Mhm.
on paper, that's a very simple thing. You just have ropes that are crossed, they're suspended above, but there's so many complexities to an Ultimate X match, and it's always the most beautiful challenge to try to solve that puzzle, and especially if you throw in people like Hammerstone, who on
Mhm.
paper, shouldn't be in an Ultimate X match, but to have elements like that in it, as well as different companies mixing into the trademark match from TNA. I feel like the opportunities are endless with this one. I feel like my reign as X Division champion is just beginning and it's already red hot. So I feel like making that match special is going to be an important part of this championship reign for me.
I just did a ropes and zip line course this weekend, and climbing up, like, I can only imagine, like, that was difficult enough. I can imagine what trying to climb across those cables will do. So,
So this is the thing about Ultimate X, right? It's impressive. You see it, the ropes are above the ring and you have to hang like dead hang from them for sometimes a very long time. And it looks hard, but it's 10 times harder than you'd imagine. It's crazy. Honestly, the way it looks never does it justice. It feels 10 times higher than it looks on TV, and it is terrifying.
well, I wish you luck this weekend for not only climbing the ropes, but continuing your championship reign. Impact Emergence is Friday, August 30th, and then there's a TV taping the next night. Both of them are at Old Forester's Parish Town Hall in Louisville. Uh, Thanks for spending some time talking about the new docuseries, and have a good day.
Thank you so much for having me.